Greetings, everybody. I'm so delighted to see all of you here. It's a special occasion, so welcome. This is the first annual Director's Lecture of the Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and we're hoping to make this a ritual event that recurs, we hope, yes. And come to think, I know who's missing. Okay, I'm about to mention him. So before introducing our honored guest and saying a few words, let me say a few words about CEERES for a sec. And that our big event of the big development this year is that we once again won a National Research Center Award, which is very important. We have lots of money now for 4 years of programming, and we're continuing an already existing past of much programming. So this is something that is handed out to only a handful of agencies or centers around the country. It's a federal grant. It is really a big deal. So it's an accomplishment. And for helping to make this accomplishment a reality, I want to, where is she? I want to thank Esther Peters, our wonderful Associate Director, who is, in addition to setting this up, which you'll see we'll have a little reception at the end, is also in charge of the series of voices, our outreach program, our blog, and all sorts of things. And I thank you, Esther. It's been great working with you for 2 years. I really enjoyed it. I wanted also to glimpse back a moment and tell you about Victor Friedman, who's supposed to be here, but it's a little bit like Victor Friedman, not to exactly show up on time. But I wanted to also ask to thank Meredith Clayson, because Victor and Meredith were the previous people who were in charge of getting us the previous set of National Research Center Awards, which were enormously important and was something for us to build on. So thank you, Meredith. Since we've glanced backward for a moment, I want to also glance forward and tell you that I am deeply pleased, grateful that at this particular event I am able to announce that we will have a new director for the next 3-4 years, who is Eugene Repeal of the Department of Comparative Human Development, and he is an anthropologist and a sometime Russianist. Is that about? A Russianist who's also working in other things in other parts of the world. So thank you, Eugene, for taking this on and for accepting the invitation of the advisory board. Okay. So now I can get to what's really happening at this event tonight, this afternoon, and that is the heart of our evening, which is to welcome our speaker today, who is Éva Fodor, who is a friend, a colleague, and a collaborator over the years in a number of projects that we've worked on together. A scholar whom I respect enormously. Éva is a Hungarian sociologist and gender studies scholar who has a PhD from UCLA, so she's bi-continental, and has also worked in the United States quite a bit. She has done important work on the working lives, comparative important work on the working lives of Austrian and Hungarian women, among the first of these controlled comparative studies. Her book, published by Duke, is entitled Working Difference, and I recommend it to all of you. But these days, more preoccupying than any kind of research that she might be doing is her work at the Central European University. She is Pro-Rector, which basically means Dean of the Humanities and Social Sciences. It's a big deal. So the Central European University, for those who have been, in a rabbit hole for the last 2 years, is an American university giving out American master's and PhD degrees, so it's a graduate university in Budapest, and has over the last 2 years been attacked by the government of Hungary, basically because it's a liberal institution providing liberal ideas to its students from around the whole region. It's not limited to Hungary at all. So although moving from chairing the Gender Studies Department to being dean seemed like it might be a respite because of what goes on in Gender Studies departments. In fact, it was jumping into the fire because it came out pretty much near the start of the attack, and it turned into a very challenging task to deal with, to try to fight the attack. And despite global support, really from all parts of the world for the CEU, in fact, the attack succeeded. The CEU has been expelled, made illegal and expelled from Budapest, and is moving, thank goodness, to Vienna as of this year, and in stages. Now, as dean, Éva has been active at the center of these difficult conflicts, but more importantly for our talk today, as a sociologist, she's been actively analyzing what has been going on in Hungary and in Europe more broadly as the extreme right gains more and more power, and the implications of that for gender and sexuality. So her talk today is entitled How to Use Gender to Dismantle a Democracy, Lessons from Hungary, Lessons for Europe. So please help me join me in welcoming Éva Fodor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, for organizing this, and thank you for coming. It is a great pleasure to be here and talk to you about these rather difficult issues. So let me start. Interesting. Let me start with a quote from a book which profoundly shaped my thinking, and except this is not quite working. Here's the book.
Oh.
It is entitled The Politics of Gender After Socialism, and it was written by Susan Gall and Gail Kligman. And in this book, they argue and explain in detail how ideas about gender and ideas about reproduction specifically shape political and economic change. They claim, and I quote, that public discussions about reproduction makes politics. Now, I'd like to make a similar point today in this talk, and I will argue that notions of gender itself and specific forms of a gender regime serve as essential building blocks of Hungary's newly authoritarian political regime and foreign investment-dependent economy, both the political regime and the economic structure. And by extension, not just that of Hungary, but that of similar and similarly leaning political regimes elsewhere. Now, Hungary is a small country. I'm not sure how many of you know exactly where it is. And it is tiny. So, but elements of what I will talk about will be familiar to many of you from all over the world. If you have experience in Poland, in Romania, Russia, Italy, in Latin American countries, or to some extent, the United States as well. This is why the Hungarian case is important. Were Hungary alone in its descent to authoritarianism, then we could easily glide over what's going on in this little nook of the world. But it isn't, so we can't. And understanding what's going on is crucial to organize a better response to what is happening in so many parts of our global empire. And considering issues related to gender is, I will argue, really important. Not only really important to be able to respond to this situation and to understand the situation. So, in this talk, I will start by briefly describing this emergent political regime in Hungary, and then I will get to my argument and describe how the concept of gender itself is being used by Hungarian authorities to claim political power. And then third, I will be talking about the gender regime, so the policies that follow from the use of the concept of gender, and so how the gender regime of an illiberal democracy or a illiberal state is imagined and is executed. I think I think that these points are related. Related. End of the sentence. These points are related. Okay, so let me start with the first one. What is an illiberal state? So when I started graduate school in sociology in the fall of 1991 at UCLA, as Sue mentioned, I was struck by my classmates and professors' curiosity about Hungary and the region where I came from, Eastern Europe. Again, it's a small country. I was wondering why people were so interested. But perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, because really a genuine revolution was taking place in Eastern Europe in real time. So even though there was no bloodshed, at least not by 1991, what was happening was truly revolutionary. What could be more interesting for a group of budding sociologists than a revolution? Specifically, the dismantling of an authoritarian regime, the communist state socialist regime in this part of the world. So several of my US-born colleagues started to learn the obscure languages of Eastern Europe and wrote dissertations on this part of the world, and spent some of their careers studying it. Now, a revolution is in the making in Eastern Europe again. But this one seems to garner a whole lot less attention, particularly less attention from sociologists. This revolution is quite different from the one that had happened in the 1990s. What's going on is that elements of authoritarian rule are being reinstituted in several countries of the post-socialist region. Now, the ringleader in this process is Hungary, and Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, and his ruling party, Fidesz, that is the name of the party. Fidesz and Orbán came to power in 2010, so they've been in power for almost 10 years, almost a decade ago, and they've been steadily dismantling democratic institutions in the country. By now, Hungary is not a liberal democracy, not democracy at all. It is an authoritarian regime with a single party rule. All this happened in the past 10 years, 9. International organizations, including the European Union, have noticed the changes and have been reacting in their slow and rather measured ways. The European Commission has started numerous infringement procedures and other types of procedures against Hungary, and Fidesz, the party, the ruling party, was suspended from its party coalition group. And their position after the elections is still not clear, so it's unclear what's going to happen after the elections to the party's position within its party family and in the European Union in general. But and other agencies also started to note that there are some changes in Hungary. So, for example, Freedom House, this international watchdog of democracy, downgraded Hungary to the category of partly free, which is interesting because this has never ever happened to other European countries before. Even the Heritage Foundation reduced Hungary's score on its index of economic freedom. So international organizations have noted the decline in freedoms in Hungary, but not much has happened other than that. Now, Viktor Orbán visited with your president, with Mr. Trump, a few weeks ago, and Mr. Trump praised him, I quote, for the good work that he has been doing. So let me give you, in a way to introduce what's going on in Hungary, what's been going on in Hungary for the past 10 years, let me give you a list of things that Mr. Trump might have meant by good works. So what did the Orbán government accomplish in the past 10 years? In 2010, very soon after the elections, the Fidesz government used its supermajority in parliament, they had a 2/3 majority, to pass a new constitution, which basically cemented their power. One change, an important change in the constitution, was the reformulation of the electoral law to tilt the playing field in their direction. There have been 2 other elections since 2010, and Fidesz won every time. International organizations call these elections free but not fair, given the laws that have been rewritten in that constitution, as well as other limitations on, for example, media freedom. But just this Sunday, at the European parliamentary elections, Fidesz, the ruling party, got 52% of the votes, which is actually a little less than what most people had been expected. So it was, it seemed like a victory, ironically, even though they got the majority, and the majority was significant. After their election in 2010, the Prime Minister wasted no time appointing loyalists to manage all significant state institutions, from the National Bank to the National Theatre and everything in between. I really mean all state institutions. if any of these lackeys who are appointed into these positions dares to voice even sort of the slightest protest or the slightest critique of its policies, he, and it's typically a he, loses his job overnight. There's been several examples of this. Now, then the government limited the power of the Supreme Court in this constitution and extended its executive power over the judiciary, or at least tried to. But then some judges still insisted on retaining a semblance of independence. So now a new additional type of court system is being introduced, which is explicitly dependent on the state. So it's not even a secret that this will be a court system where decision making will be decided or will be at least guided by members of the government. So the concept of separation of powers is gone. The government seized most media outlets. 76% of media outlets in Hungary are owned by government, by the government, or indirectly owned by the government. Basically, government cronies bought up by international intermediaries the vast majority of national and the rural media especially. And these media unabashedly are utilized to spread government propaganda. It's difficult to call it anything else but propaganda. And these are extremely reminiscent of the communist times. I remember those very vividly. There is no media freedom in Hungary. And the vast majority of the news that people have access to is sheer propaganda, especially in the countryside. In addition, taxpayers sponsored posters lined the streets and the roads. This is another way for the government to spread its messages. I will show you a few examples. Corruption is so widespread that Hungary has been, again, one of those international indexes, Hungary has been downgraded to the last ranks in Transparency International's annually compiled corruption index. This is the agency that creates these indexes and measures the degree of corruption. The government has been openly siphoning off European Union structural funds to its cronies and family members in an effort to build a network of supporters. Now, what is really unbelievable is that several of their dealings and wheelings have been uncovered and published in the media. But, nothing happens. They still retain their power. Nobody has gone to jail. Even when the European Union's anti-corruption agency came to Hungary and uncovered and publicized everywhere, in every piece of media that was willing to publish it, the obvious acts of corruption that were committed by the brother-in-law of the Prime Minister, the chief prosecutor, who is, of course, in the pocket of the Prime Minister, refused to prosecute him. So this is really the end of what we call the rule of law. At the same time, workers, people working in factories and also in state bureaucracies have become increasingly subject to the whims of employers because new labor laws have been introduced, basically to please international investors. Most recently, within the past 3 weeks, the work hours of civil servants was increased by half an hour a day, and their vacation days were cut by 25%. This was completely out of the blue. What is also surprising, or what may be surprising to you, that there was no measurable protest because people are simply scared for their jobs. They just said, well, that's the new situation. It's also really important to understand that once you lose a job, once you protest and you lose your job, you're blacklisted and you'll never get another one. The government has limited the rights of political actors, and NGOs and international NGOs are being harassed continuously in a variety of ingenious ways. Instead, the government has created fake NGOs, government-funded organizations that are expected, that kind of seem like civil organizations, but that are supposed to push their own agenda. And the government also has abandoned the principle of academic freedom. It exercises strict financial and intellectual control over state universities. It has stripped the Hungarian Academy of Sciences of its research budget, as in completely, and also its research institutes, the research institutes that the Academy has been funding and managing, and placed all of these, particularly funding, under direct state control. in an effort to distribute research funding to whoever and for whatever purpose that they please. It also passed a new law that Sue mentioned that forced my university, which is a private graduate school called the Central European University, out of Hungary for no other than political reasons. And last but not least, the Prime Minister and members of his government and parliament regularly express the most racist, homophobic, and xenophobic comments that you can imagine. And they celebrate openly anti-Semitic figures of Hungary's not so distant past, and use not only that, and use state funds to spread these messages and messages of hatred and intolerance. Basically, hatred and intolerance against a whole range of others. One set of others are migrants. This is an example. This is one of those posters, media campaigns or poster campaigns that the government creates on a regular basis. This is from 2016, and it says, "Did you know migrants committed the terrorist attacks in Paris?" This is one piece of a variety, a long list of campaigns against migrants and migration, again suggesting that migrants are all terrorists. I could give you lots more examples from, for example, the most recent one when the president of the Hungarian parliament, this is, an important political figure. He would be the president should the current president die. So he's very high up in the hierarchy. Compared really explicitly the desire of same-sex couples to have children to pedophilia. He said that out, very clearly. There was no wishing for it. Anybody else would have to design. So in most other countries, somebody would have to resign if they were caught even thinking that. Not so in Hungary. But let me quote the most scary one that that I've seen recently. A claim by Viktor Orbán, which reeks of racism of the worst kind. I'll show you why. He said recently, "I am the most Christian of all, and thus the most European of all Europeans. I represent Europe's DNA. I am its guardian." This is the first time that Orbán designated himself as a person, not Hungary or Hungarians, as the one who represents civilization, and does so by making references to genetic material. This, of course, is reminiscent for a lot of Hungarians, a lot of people in this region. It reminds us of the not so recent past when genetic belonging, genetics was so important. So the fact that he mentions DNA and himself being the guardian of the proper DNA is extremely scary. Then this is just last year. Now, when you look at each of these things on this list, I'm sure many of these things are familiar, and certainly they're familiar from the history of the region and the history of Hungary. There's corruption and there's cronyism and attempts at curbing the power of the judiciary, and there's biased media and statements reeking of homophobia and racism and sexism and just about every other types of hatred elsewhere as well. I realize that. The above, all of these are global phenomena, but the concentration of these political changes within a fairly short period of time, 9 years, and in a single country is unique. And especially for a country that is accepted as a full member of the European Union, of NATO, and by the way, a good friend of the United States as well. So, what to call this beast, this new form of government? Political scientists have been having a ball trying to name it. The most popular one is illiberal democracy. This is what Orbán himself called the regime a few years ago. Then he changed his mind and decided that it's actually a Christian democracy. It's in red because this is the current self-designation of the regime. But there are many others. So, for example, an anti-democratic hybrid regime, populist democracy, one-party state, a neo-Bolshevik state, authoritarian capitalism, national authoritarianism. Others just talk about democratic backsliding and democratic decline, erosion of democracy. Managed illiberal democratic capitalism, a mafia state, populist moment, populist authoritarianism. This is a selection of the terms that political scientists have been trying to apply to what's going on in Hungary and in this part of the world. I think it's important, and political classifications are really important, but sociologists have not yet started to dissect how this regime shapes social structure, what kinds of discourses and policies it produces and why, and how these are legitimated. And this is what I want to start to tackle now. So I would like to move beyond the classifications and sort of a description on a political level of this regime and talk more about what is really happening, what is driving it inside. So specifically, in the second part of the paper, I will focus on how ideas about gender and also how policies and politics which target specifically women and gender relations constitute a solid foundation of this new society. So, to get to that, after the fall, let me go back a bit. After the fall of the Ceausescu regime in Romania in the 1990s, one of the first pieces of legislation that was passed was by the new parliament, by the first post-communist parliament, was the repeal of the infamous ban on abortion. This had been, in effect for decades, and it had been making the lives of women miserable. The repeal of this legislation was really symbolic of the collapse of the communist regime. Now, somewhat analogously, one of the first pieces of legislation passed by the Fidesz government in Hungary in 2010 was the elimination of the concept of gender theory from the national curriculum of kindergartens. I realize that we're only talking about kindergarten curricula, but still it was very important. So in line with European Union guidelines previous to 2010, teachers had been required to focus on gender equality and guide children to respect diversity and, teach children to play with all sorts of toys, etc. All this had to stop in 2010, and as of that time, kindergarten teachers were instructed to ignore all of this, stop trying to weaken gender stereotypes, in fact, try and strengthen gender stereotypes, and guide children to fully realize their sex roles. This may sound insignificant, but given that this was one of the first pieces of legislation, and also that it was 2010, which is fairly early on, it reflected an ongoing trend, and it signified the parties and the government's early and immediate identification with what came to be called anti-gender movement. So it was a symbolic move, and a symbolic move that sort of showed belonging, showed the political colors of the regime really early on. The same theme was picked up in 2017, so just 2 years ago, when the government de-accredited MA degrees in gender studies in Hungary, basically erasing gender studies from the list of disciplines that somebody can get a degree in. Hungary never had BA degrees in gender studies, but an MA degree was accredited several years ago. And for example, my university, we granted MA degrees to students, and we ran courses within the Hungarian education system, at the end of which you could get an MA degree in gender studies. From one moment to the other, the Hungarian government decided that that cannot happen anymore, and they basically crossed out gender studies from the list of disciplines that were offered. They argued that gender studies was not a legitimate field of study. Instead, it was a propaganda device, they claimed, deployed by international lobbyists whose goal was to turn little boys into little girls. And the goal was also to persuade children that they can choose their genders as they pleased. Now, Hungarian leaders are not alone in their denunciation of gender as a useful category of inquiry or policy making. In the past 10 years, a true global movement has coalesced, which targets what is called genderism. That is the promotion of policies on gender equality, gender mainstreaming, reproductive rights, and the rights of sexual minorities. Attacks against these values have been recorded in a number of countries, some peaceful, some less so. This is a picture of a protest from one of the earliest protests in France against same-sex marriage. And here's a protest in Brazil with the where, and you recognize the person in the picture, obviously. In 2015, even the Vatican expressed this distaste for the notion of gender theory, and they issued an encyclical specifically decrying the problems with gender theory. But also then, since then, in Germany, Spain, Poland, Italy, Croatia, anti-gender activists have targeted sexual education in schools, as well as abortion rights and the rights of sexual minorities. Even in Latin America, huge protests were organized, especially in Colombia and Mexico in 2016, against what was perceived as the imposition of gender ideology, and specifically the proposal to allow same-sex marriage. So anti-gender theory, some researchers argue, played a significant role even in the failure of the vote on the Colombian Peace Accord in 2016. Okay, so these are just a few examples. And you can, even from these, if you study these movements, and researchers have done that, this anti-gender movement is quite diverse, and the hold that it has on governments and civil society is also quite different across countries. But there are similarities, and these are noteworthy and important to understand. I think the Hungarian case illustrates at least two of the similarities across these movements. The first one is that anti-genderism is part of the politics of fear. Anti-gender activists tend to construct an enemy figure and ignite fear and hatred against it. Political discourse centers on a vital threat, an attack against the people and the nation by a designated enemy, and politicians argue that a war must be fought to counteract this. In this case, the enemy are genderists, who threaten the sexual identity of innocent children and threaten to disrupt families and communities. It is not accidental that a significant part of the anti-gender movement was focused on protests against sex education in schools. Now, anti-gender activists express anxiety about the upheaval of the social order in general. And some researchers claim that this movement emerged as a form of a form of post-traumatic stress, not just in the psychological, but also in the economic sense. After the 2008 economic crisis, when economic and social policies could not really provide satisfactory solutions to the problems that the crisis raised. But there are other types of anxieties involved as well, related to these, yet somewhat different. And these often have to do with anxieties about national identity, belonging, and nationhood. The Hungarian case illustrates these links, so let me illustrate this with a quote from a well-known Hungarian biologist who, upon hearing about the ban on gender studies, decided to publish this thought piece. And he argued that gender ideology is destructive. It is the final phase of the destruction of the structure of society. It is in line with the elimination of national identity, with acts against the family, and with attacks against the individual. It is a way to destabilize individual identity. You see here the professor's anxiety about the destruction of the social order in general, and the link that he shows from the individual to the family, to society, and the social order, and ultimately to the nation. This is typically sort of how this link, the linkage of these things is actually typical of this discourse. I could show you a number of similar pronouncements from Hungary and elsewhere. Anti-gender activists often express anxiety about self and society and nationhood, and illiberal rulers utilize these fears to build up a vision of the enemy. This is why, by the way, in Hungary, anti-genderism has actually been quite weak, because the Hungarian government has chosen a different kind of enemy figure, that of the migrant, which is similarly mythical because there are actually very few migrants in Hungary. One poster mocking the government campaign said, the average Hungarian has seen more UFOs than migrants, and that's about right. Nevertheless, it is the figure of the migrant that's constructed as an enemy, And I should add that, of course, that enemy is also gendered. He's typically a man and prone to violence against women and prone to terrorist attacks. But so in some sense, there are analogies between the politics of fear that's being waged using the figure of the enemy, the migrant as the enemy, and what's happening in the theme of anti-genderism. And in Hungary, there was more emphasis on the migrant, but arguments about the gender lobbyists were also very strong. So the first issue, the first similarity across these movements is the idea of hate mongering and basically creating the figure of the enemy in the international gender lobby. The second point is exactly this international nature of the gender plot. So global anti-genderism has a second characteristic, which makes it politically attractive for authoritarianism. Ironically, its proponents often utilize a post-colonial argument. They claim that genderism genderism forces something on a country. This is something that's been forced on a country by international organizations. And those international organizations do not understand the country's old traditions, the country's ways of operating. They do not understand the people and the people's desires who live in those countries. The goal of these organizations, the argument goes, is simply to weaken other countries and to utilize their human and material resources for their own purposes. So like colonizers, the goal is to use what this country has to offer. Gender equality, sexual rights are whims of the greedy and decadent, that's also important, global north. And its representatives, who vary, by the way, from the European Union to the UN. The UN is often used, you see here UNICEF. This is a protest against UNICEF. But also George Soros, of course, is one of them. Here's a quote from an activist who wrote this in Hungary, arguing for the ban on gender studies. She said, "Children are taught using sexual educational material from the UN," she says, "which includes things like choosing your own gender and that this should be accepted. These documents are produced with the help of various lobbyists." So you see here that the argument that this is being foisted on Hungary by external forces and external people who are trying to, they're lobbyists that are trying to reach some sort of an agenda. Okay, so to sum up, anti-genderism has been gathering strength in the past decade all over the world, and by now it has become a political force influencing policymaking and electoral outcomes. It varies from location to location in its focus and also in its political toolkits, but shows a strong elective affinity with authoritarian rule, both right-wing and sometimes in Latin America, for example, also left-wing populism. It is a force that we need to be aware of, and one that profoundly shapes policy making and also shapes the gender regime of the illiberal, has shaped the gender regime of illiberal Hungary. So now, after this, let me go on to the third part of my talk and talk about this gender regime. A gender regime creates the image of the ideal citizen. What does Hungary's ideal citizen look like? Ideal female Hungarian citizen look like? I will, of course, there are lots of characteristics, but I will highlight two, and through that, I will describe two sets of policies that are important to understand the gender regime of the country. So the first one is that the ideal female citizen in Hungary is a mother who has a lot of children, at least 3+. But in addition to that, she is also working for wages in the primary economy if she has support from grandparents or has access to some institutional support, so state support or in state care. But if not, then is available in the care fair programs that have been introduced recently. to illustrate this, now, so all of this is built on a very strong and sets of ideas about gender. And let me start by describing that. And to do that, I'm going to use a publication that was, this is it. It is entitled "A Woman's Soul as Seen Through Men's Eyes." This is a government. This was published by a government-sponsored organization to celebrate the International Day of Women. It was published in 2018. It was also republished in 2019. And in this publication, they asked 90 men, artists, and public figures to send the message to women. I analyzed, in an effort to entertain you mostly, I analyzed the discourse of 35 of them, the politicians. So the messages of high-level politicians. We're talking about heads of ministries, so state secretaries and their deputies, members of the government. And let me describe three characteristics. If the messages were really tediously similar to each other. And there were three things that stood out. One of them is that they all emphasized women's difference from men. Here's a quote from the Vice President of the Hungarian Parliament. "Overemphasizing equality between men and women, which often means the denial of sex differences, leads to the rejection of womanhood and womanly virtues." So it is sexual difference that is a value, not gender equality. This is very important. That's one of the basic pieces of the ideology that the Hungarian gender regime rests on. Now, he's talking about womanly virtues. The second thing that was similar in all these messages was the character of those womanly virtues. And basically, what he's talking about is motherhood. Here's a little message from the Deputy Secretary of State for Human Affairs. These are the people who oversee education, healthcare, and all these things that have to do with human beings. So he said, "God gave women a special gift, the most magical calling possible, which forever changes the life of a woman, and as a result, our men's lives as well. This is motherhood." None of the 35 politicians acknowledged any woman who does not have children in this publication. Mind you, this was a publication for the International Day of Women, not a Mother's Day publication. They did not, and these are people who work in ministries in state administration surrounded by women. 80% of the people that they are on a daily basis surrounded by are women. Yet, practically none of them mentioned women as people who are working outside the home. Motherhood was their calling. Women older women who do not have children intentionally or unintentionally, just did not figure in this whole story. And the third point is particularly interesting, and that was formulated best by Hungary's State Secretary for Finance. This is a very powerful man, and he's a very observant man because he understood that there's something called invisible labor. And he praised women for doing the invisible labor in the household. He understood, there's a lot of domestic work that women have to do, and it's amazing how they can do it. And then he said, and this is the third bit that is going to be interesting, the lion's share of such invisible domestic work is done by women. They do this not because they expect something in return or want to get paid. Women do not want to get paid for care work, he claims. They do it because they feel it is the right thing to do. So the third point that these people were making was that women are expected to do care work, and they should not expect much in return other than love and respect. Okay, so this is the ideological backdrop of Hungary's gender regime. And on the basis of this, in recent years, Hungary passed two pieces of legislation which are very important here, and those are the ones that I will be talking about. One of them is a pronatalist policy package. Which I think is so radical that I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. This is basically the government's another poster campaign by the government. You see, so even the color scheme is the same. This says Family Action Plan, and the reason why it's interesting is because of because the way they describe a family. It's clearly a young couple. And here's the same. This poster was used in the government's campaign for the European Union elections. It says children are our first priority, and this is the Family Protection Action Plan. Now, Hungary's welfare regime has been described as familial or maternalist for the past several decades. Policies on parental leave and family policies have not changed radically since the middle of the 1980s. That is, so before the collapse of the communist or the state socialist regime. The centerpiece of the country's family policies is a 3-year paid parental leave. So if you have a child, this is a universal right. If you have a child, you can go on parental leave for 3 years. For people in the US, this I'm sure is particularly shocking. And what's also shocking is that actually most people do take it. So a vast percent of Hungarian women drop out of the labor force for 3 years after they have children. For the first 2 years, if they had a job, they can use an insurance-based version of the leave and get paid reasonably well. For the last third year, the payment is very small, but their jobs are more or less protected. And the expectation indeed is, and Hungarians are convinced that if children are not taken care of by their mothers until age 3, then not a minute more, not a minute less, but until age 3, then they will surely and uniformly turn to crime and alcoholism immediately. So this 3-year policy is one of the most popular welfare measures in Hungary, and it is one of the few, practically the only remnants of the state socialist past. It's been in effect, the 3-year policy has been in effect since 1967, with some changes. Now, Fidesz kept this, but added a few new elements to this mix, turning this into, as I said, the most radical pro-natalist policy that I've ever seen. It has become, it kept the spirit of a maternalist welfare state, but it turned into an intergenerationally maternalist welfare state. So what are the elements? What are the new elements? So in 2014, the government introduced what in the US is called earned income tax credits. This means that families get a tax reduction if they have children, a significant tax reduction, even after the second child, but certainly so after the third. There's also conditional cash transfers for families. This is a universal right, but the sum of that you can receive has not changed since 2009. So it has devalued to about a third of its original value. In addition, young couples, young families who have or promise to have children, it's not to promise, can get really cheap mortgages and cheap loans to buy large cars. Similarly, young couples can apply for a 10 million Hungarian forints, which is about $35,000 loan, with a very favorable interest rate. And if they have 3 children, then they do not have to pay it back. Women with 3 children do not have to pay income tax ever. That got me thinking about maybe having a few more. As I have mentioned, Hungary has a 3-year parental leave. But in addition, this was somewhat changed. And as of last year, if you have a child while you're on parental leave, you can keep and go back to work. No, if you have a child while you're on parental leave, you get double the amount. If you return to work, you can keep the parental leave and get your salary in addition. And finally, as of last year, grandparents can also take parental leave, both the insurance-based and the universal kind. I saw this picture, again, part of the government's campaign on these family policies. It's interesting because there's a grandfather in the picture. This is really the only time that I've seen the government depicting men taking care of children. But then I thought maybe after a certain age you kind of lose your gender. So the fact that this is a man playing with a small child is perhaps less important. Now, sounds good, right? It's an amazing set of policies supporting families really profoundly. There's a catch, unfortunately. And the catch is that all these policies target a very specific group of women and families, white middle class people with jobs. and at the same time they exclude the truly needy. These are the people who are excluded first. And how? So how does that happen? Only those are eligible for the loans and the mortgage and the earned income tax credit and the loan for the car who work for wages and do so in the formal economy. According to the most recent ILO statistics, about 30% of Hungarians work in the informal economy. So they work in undeclared jobs, they don't pay taxes, they're not eligible for any of this. And these are, of course, the most precarious jobs to start with. Second, even those who do have formal jobs often cannot utilize the full amount of the benefits. Most jobs in Hungary do not pay enough to get the full amount and do not allow you to buy a 7-person car or buy a new home for which these loans would be used. And in fact, statistics show that about a third of those with children are unable to claim the full amount of the benefit because their wages are simply not enough. There is no negative credit to the earned income tax credit, unlike in the US. So if you don't pay tax, so if your taxes are lower than the amount of money that you would be getting, then you lose the difference. Third, couples who apply must be formally married, and the children must be born to the married couple. Now, 30% of Hungarian children are born out of wedlock to couples who live together but are not married. Couples where both parties are divorced are also not eligible, and Hungary's divorce rate is one of the highest in the European Union. 67% of divorces, of marriages end in divorce. So the fact that you have two people having children who are both already divorced once, is not unheard of. Also, only heterosexual unions count as marriage. So same-sex couples are also not eligible. And neither are women over 50, for reasons that are completely unknown to me, especially because I had both my children after the age of 40. So women over 40 are not eligible. And a lot of people have children over 40. So this is, other than ageism, there's no explanation for that. So a lot of groups are excluded. These policies basically reinforce and codify Hungary's already existing two-track welfare state. They grant full citizenship to middle-class, white, heterosexual, healthy adults with a lot of children, and deny these rights from others. From poor women, a disproportionate number of whom belong to Hungary's ethnic minority, the Roma. You see that here. From single parents, same-sex couples, etc. So this is welfare for the middle class, and a very expensive version of that. Politically, however, these policies have been extremely successful in serving the interests of the ruling party, and they have been used in the recent European Union election campaigns. And in fact, these policies have allowed Viktor Orban to be re-elected several times, because it turns out that women seem to be, yeah, that's a good picture, women seem to be voting for him disproportionately more than men. So just in the previous elections, 46%, actually I should have said 18 should be here, but 56% of men compared to 52% of women. That's actually a significant difference. It is primarily sort of married, rural, middle to lower middle class women, and less educated women who voted for him, who were more likely to vote for him in the parliamentary elections. So these policies are extremely popular politically, and bring votes politically. Okay, so I talked about two elements of the gender regime. This was the first one. So the pro-natalist policies was the first one. So let me quickly get to the second one. The second one is a boost in workfare programs, and the gendered version of that workfare program, which I will call carefare. Because Hungary's gender ideology, or the government's gender ideology, is not exactly a back-to-the-kitchen type of gender ideology. It's not only about women having children. These women are also expected to be working and be in the labor market. Now, there are plenty of jobs available right now, and unemployment is at an all-time low in Hungary. But before jobs became plentiful, in about 2011 and 2012, the Hungarian government revamped the public works program, workfare programs, and channeled all unemployment benefits through it. Right now, Hungary has the largest workfare program in the world, something to be proud of. 1% of all the working age population, working age adults, work in the workfare program, which is about twice as much proportionately as elsewhere. So in other countries, this percentage is about half the 1%. If a person becomes unemployed, instead of getting unemployment benefits, they must apply for work in the public works program. These jobs are typically allocated by local municipalities and often involve care work or outdoor cleaning work. Those are the two types. People can work full-time now, and for this privilege, they receive about 75% of the state-mandated minimum wage. So they must sign a specific contract and agree to work for less than the minimum amount that the state has mandated to pay the workers. A special kind of legal relationship has been created for this. Researchers, of course, have shown that this is a dead end and workers rarely find formal employment elsewhere. And, of course, it's not surprising that women increasingly outnumber men in workfare programs. Why? Well, I have already told you about the laws that the Hungarian government has introduced that limited workers' control over their work conditions and specifically work time. Now, a student of mine in her MA project found that the reason for being on workfare is quite different for men and women. And she found that a lot of women choose workfare jobs over other types of work options. There are other work options available for simple work-family balance reasons. They understand that the wages are low, but this is a formal job, so they're eligible for some of the benefits. They may not be able to find similar jobs for more money, and also these jobs allow them to have sick leave. It also allows them to stop working at predictable hours to be able to pick up children from daycare. And they feel that they're less vulnerable to the whims of employers compared to those working in factories or the service industry. In addition, of course, this whole thing, the fact that women would be working in care work and working for really low wages is legitimized by the gender ideology that the government is producing. And I've shown you the quote from the Minister of Finance, who argues that women should not really be expected to pay for care work of any sort. So in analogous fashion, by the way, the government recently introduced legislation which turned foster parenting, which is often a voluntary activity, into a formal paid job. Foster parents get paid less than the state-mandated minimum wage and basically work day and night without much institutional support with children who would really need institutional support. So the work of working as a foster parent is a really difficult job. But foster parents also must do care fare. So they work in a kind of like a workfare arrangement where they have to agree to work for less than the minimum wage. And they do that because partly for altruistic reasons, but partly also because other types of jobs do not allow them the freedom to manage their own children and to have any sort of control over their work lives. Okay, so my argument is that what we're witnessing is the construction of what I called workfare. So workfare designated for women and based on assumptions about gender difference. Women, especially less educated women, are expected to aspire for state-funded care work, where wages are lower than the minimum wage, and this is legitimated by an understanding that care is women's natural calling and something that they do as they do instinctually. It's not a skilled form of work. Now, the social consequences of this is obvious, and let me just show you really quickly one thing. Here what you see are poverty rates for different social groups. The blue bar represents 2010 and the red one 8 years later, 2018. So you see the change. What you see is if you look at the picture for everybody, the whole population, not much has changed. But the poverty rate of women has gone up and the poverty rate for men declined. But what's really striking is the poverty rate of single parents, which has increased quite a lot. And if you compare the poverty rates for households with children and without children, what you see is that the poverty rate for households with children has gone down because of some of these measures, but the poverty rate of households without children has increased immensely. Another measure is gender equality, and there's a gender equality index that's put together by the European Union's Gender Institute, and Hungary has been declining on that index right now. We're the last but one in the European Union, and the distance between the country and the EU has been growing. Here what you see is the number of women and the number of men working, and what you see is that the gap between men and women is growing. Okay, and now to summarize. So, how to summarize this gender regime the gender regime of an illiberal state? How does gender figure in shaping political ambitions, social and economic policy, and ultimately sort of our social fabric? So let me highlight just a handful of points. So first, the concept of gender itself, not women and not gender equality or gender inequality, has become the subject of political discourse, gender theory. And it is being used to legitimate typically right-wing authoritarian rule. This is about the anti-gender movement that I talked about. Second, authoritarian regimes tend to use specific groups of people for specific purposes. In liberal Hungary, not migrants, but middle-class women are expected to produce the next generation of workers. This is often set in contrast. Other countries choose migration. Hungarians choose pronatalism. So middle-class women are expected to produce the next generation of workers who will then realize the government's and, of course, the European Union's ambition to turn Hungary into the ideal location to service the manufacturing and administrative needs of the European Union. Those who do not fit this category are struggling to avoid destitution, do not have a lot of options available. For them, carefare is one of those opportunities that's being offered. And in this context, in the specifically poor labor market context, carefare, so working in stable jobs for minuscule amounts of money, actually is attractive. The women my MA student interviewed were actually quite happy about having access to these jobs, and arguably some of the political gains that the government made was due to the fact that people appreciated the availability of workfare, carefare jobs. And finally, this gender regime is presented as an alternative to migration and as a way to avoid the death of the nation, the elimination of the nation. It brings both. I showed you how it brings gender, so in a gendered way, and therefore serves as a source of legitimacy. So the gender regime itself, this specific type of gender relations, serve as a form of legitimacy, legitimating the political rule of the regime. And finally, I think it is important to understand that authoritarian regimes of this sort not merely reshuffle, but also increase inequalities and increase hardship for various groups of people. And in those groups, women often outnumber men. I talked about women outnumber men within the older population. This is, of course, excluding everybody over reproductive age. It also excludes people in non-traditional families, those working in the informal economy, or those living in distant rural areas, etc. So there are clearly identifiable groups of people who are excluded, and for whom poverty has increased, or in those groups poverty has increased a great deal. So Hungary's gender regime is thus an integral component of the political and economic system of authoritarianization. And ironically, while the political leaders seek to ignore the concept of gender, their actual policies reinforce its salience, both in political discourse, but also in policy making and in everyday life. Thank you. final point, look at this is another poster to push the government's agenda. And it's really interesting. You see the family, blonde mom and dad and the 3 children. But what's really interesting that they're unpacking boxes of stuff that they clearly bought using the mortgages and using the loans that they got from the government. So this so clearly ties having children to a financial gain that it borders on the offensive.
So, will you take questions?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
So please, the traffic cop.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. It's incredibly informative and, of course, horrifying. I wanted to ask you to say more about what it is that gender does and sort of normative gender does for the move towards authoritarianism or the move away from democracy that, let's say, xenophobia doesn't do. I mean, I know you link these different things up, but is there something distinctive about anti-genderism in terms of?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. I think there's lots of analogies between what gender and xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiments do. Gender, I think, brings up issues of reproduction more than any of the others. So the anxieties expressed by anti-genderists and representatives of the anti-gender movement often have to do more with sexuality and reproduction and having children than the other types of anxieties. So I think it's the set of anxieties that it evokes that makes it different. So, for example, in Hungary, migrants bring up anxieties related to violence and terrorist attacks. And that's a different kind of anxiety that it induces. So the anti-gender movement creates a different type of fear, a fear of a different type of enemy to some extent.
I'll follow directly on that, which is, it struck me that the way in which pronatalism is figuring in this is in creating new patterns of dependency of women on the state, right? So that much of this dynamic is dependent on a regime that's happy to pump out benefits in more or less generous ways. And that's actually quite different than how it often works in the U.S. other cases where it's linked to austerity, and anti-feminist policies will be oriented towards increasing the dependence of women on men as private individuals. So sort of the puzzle is, one might expect that this kind of move would actually unman the men, right? And so does that happen, and if not, why not?
It's a lovely question. I mean, the talk is always not so much about women, but about the family. But sometimes it is about women. So, for example, when Viktor Orbán was re-elected for the 3rd time, he made a speech, an acceptance speech, and in it he said, as of tomorrow, I want to make a pact with women. And he said, I want to introduce these new policies to encourage women to have more children. But he addressed women and only women. In fact, feminists were upset about the fact that he sort of assumed that only women have any choice in having children, so men have no say over whether or not to have children. So in that sense, yes, it does ignore men on some level. On another level, of course, it assigns other types of rights and privileges to men, basically opportunities on the labor market, on the primary labor market, more so than for women. So it is creating, it's separating gender roles as much as possible, more than sort of creating sort of taking privileges away from men. But it's assigning women to this very specific sphere, and only and allowing them to enter the labor market as secondary, so encouraging them to enter the labor market, but only as secondary workers.
Just one follow-up: do the tax benefits are they linked to the women's earnings or to the family's earnings? Because that actually becomes
Yes, to the families. Some, well, actually, yes and no.
Okay.
Some or most of them are linked to the family's earnings, but often men don't make enough. So often you need two earners to claim any of the benefits, and certainly the full benefits. And some of the tax benefits are only about women. So you don't have to pay taxes after 4 children. Only women can take advantage of that. So in some sense, you're right. It's empowering women. It's no surprise that this prime minister has some popularity among women. It is creating more dependence on the state and on the family, but not so much on men, but for example, grandparents. So it's creating an intergenerational dependence too, in the name of, again, the larger family, the non-nuclear larger family directly linked to the community. Some of those values are not that offensive if you look at it in a less exclusive sort of way, but this is really only targeting certain groups of people.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering if this illiberal gender regime has included any changes in access to contraception or abortion or reproductive foundations of reproductive rights.
Not in Hungary, interestingly. Yes, in Poland, but not in Hungary. Hungarians are very supportive of the opportunity to have access to abortion. And therefore, the Hungarian government has not dared to touch it. In the new constitution that they introduced in 2010, they actually, it has a preamble, and the preamble says that life starts from the moment of conception, basically creating space for banning abortion. But they never actually did it. They haven't, or I should put it this way, they haven't done it yet. And the popular support for abortions is very strong, and Hungary, the abortion has been available in Hungary for many decades. So that I don't think that that's going to be threatened. And neither is access to contraceptives. But in other countries, in Poland, for example, which is going down a rather similar path, the abortion issue is very important. So anti-genderism is interestingly expressed in slightly different ways in different countries. And in Poland, reproductive rights is one of the issues that come up there.
Andrea, and then Andrea. I have 2 questions. You mentioned parental leave, but it seems as though only women are taking it. Do fathers ever take it? And then something that you often see in U.S. right-wing movements is women espousing a traditional gender ideology, Phyllis Schlafly, etc. And I was really struck by the International Women's Day booklet about the woman's soul seen through the eyes of men, as though the view from the man's viewpoint should be the more interesting one. And I was just curious how the appeal of this gender ideology that's supposedly anti-gender is voiced differently or at all through women in the public.
Thank you. The second one is harder to answer, so let me start with the first one. Men can also go on parental leave, but they don't. Or very few of them do, and even when they seem to be doing it, it's actually they're taking the money, but women are doing the childcare. So it's not very. There are exceptions, but a tiny fraction of people on parental leave are men. Second, women. You saw the figures for that show or the prime minister's popularity. He is more popular, and the government is more popular among women. That suggests that women are not objecting loudly to this kind of gender ideology that's expressed by the men. And from surveys of that show gender ideology, there's barely any difference between men and women.
So from Eastern European countries, post-communist, clearly Hungarian government the most fascist, if you not count like Polish maybe a little bit. They more actually fascist that Kazakhstan that theoretically could be less developed. Do you think it's because of special talent of Viktor Orban or because of population inclinations that were kind of rooted in communism?
I'm not sure I would use the word fascist because it indicates a very specific historical time. I think the word authoritarian.
The attack on Soros is fascist.
Well, the attack on George Soros can be called anti-Semitic for sure.
Which is part of fascist regime.
Yeah, still, I mean, again, we can argue about whether or not it's a good idea to use this term. I think but the other part of your question about where does this come from? Why Hungary and not other countries? I think a lot of these countries have adopted elements of these policies. Hungary is not alone. Poland, as I said, is heading in very similar directions. Romania also, Bulgaria. So some of the other countries also struggle exactly with ideas, with democratic backsliding and authoritarianization. In Hungary, I think I agree with you that this specific constellation has something to do with the prime minister and his ambitions to power, but it also has to do with Hungary's position within the European Union, the fact that Hungary has become dependent on European Union funding to a great deal, possibly more than other post-communist countries, and is dependent on the investment financial investments of mostly Germany, which creates a situation in which in which the state passes policies that makes workers more dependent on employers, more vulnerable, and therefore possibly responding more strongly to issues related to that sort of bring up fear and the figure of the enemy. So creating more economic insecurity that allows people to sort of respond more sharply or better or more favorably to these ideas about the migrant taking jobs away But it's a good question that I think somebody should really study about why Hungary and why Poland and not, say, Estonia or other countries.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was wondering about whether, like, the Hungarians that are leaving Hungary, whether you know anything about the sort of breakdown there in terms of gender, and if some of these new policies have maybe affected their decisions to not stick around.
Yes, thank you. That's another set of difficult questions. Out-migration is a whole lot more important, or a much bigger problem in Hungary than in-migration, unlike what the government is trying to show. A vast proportion of Hungarians have left the country, and in fact, the birth rate among Hungarians who live in foreign countries is significantly higher than the birth rate of Hungarians living in Hungary. There are more Hungarians born to families who are not exposed to these pro-natalist policies. Demographers have warned the Hungarian government that these policies are not going to do the trick. They might raise the birth rate for a while, for a short period of time, but then, and so people will be having those children that they had been planning to have anyway. But then, it'll peter out, as this has been shown several times with other types of policies. So to some extent, yes. But to go back and then to answer the other question, the policies this is selective pronatalism, and the selection is directed against, is clearly racist. It's directed against Hungary's, or at least one group that is directed against, is Hungary's ethnic minority, the Roma. They are more likely to be poor, they're less likely to have formal jobs, and they're more likely to have children. But those children are excluded from all of these goodies. So this is, as I said, this is a two-track welfare state. One track is for white middle-class women, and the rest for everybody else, and the rest barely benefits. So the kind of benefits that, say, a poor Roma woman has access to is the lump sum that the family benefit. And I think I mentioned that the value of this has not changed since 2009. So it has lost a third of its value since then. It was a small amount to start with, and now it's worth even less. At the same time, the tax benefits have gone up. So there's no question that this is a racist measure, and it is selective. Selective pronatalism is the right word to describe it. I think I answered most of them, but.
Okay, so Kelsey, and then the first Kelsey.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. And I have two potentially overlapping questions. We can answer one or both. But I was wondering, to what extent is the political emphasis on natural sexual differences linked to religious ideas about sexual difference? And secondly, do the discourses about sexual difference intersect with other discourses circulating about Hungary being a distinctly Christian nation?
Didn't hear the second part.
Do the discourses about sexual difference intersect with discourses about Hungary being a Christian nation?
So your question really is about religion, and interestingly, Hungarians are not terribly religious. And unlike in Poland, the Catholic Church is in the pocket of the government. So religion plays a tiny role in this sexual difference business in Hungary, unlike in Poland, where the relationship is in some ways the opposite, or at least different. So the party in power is Fidesz, and also a small minority party, the Christian Democratic Party. And whenever they want to emphasize that Hungary, that we are a Christian democracy, they push one of their representatives to the forefront. But there's no difference, and indeed, the relationship is really more state to the church. So the state is directing what should be happening in the churches, and what the agenda is that the church should be pushing, than the other way around. In Hungary, but again, that's a difference.
I actually had a somewhat similar question in that the rules about divorced couples struck me as a concession
That's
to
weird.
Catholicism, and so in other, I don't know if that's true, but it's just a suspicion, but in other parts of the world where you see these anti-gender protests, they're explicitly mobilizing evangelical votes and evangelical fury.
Sometimes.
The connection between actual voting habits and this kind of gender ideology is still a little bit opaque in my mind. How are they using this aside from more clientelist connections of we'll have these welfare programs and in exchange for party fidelity. So in what other ways do you see these connections between actual voting habits and gender ideology?
I think one connection is the decline in poverty in households with children. So there are groups of the population that are that benefit from this, and they benefit on the basis of motherhood and parenthood, which arguably is something that women appreciate more, or women find more helpful. And those groups would be expected. And those are the groups that vote, or that are more likely to vote for. Those are the groups. It is in those groups that women are more likely to vote for Fidesz than men. So I think it is via an appreciation of these policies in specific social groups, and via the benefits that these policies actually bring to specific groups of people. Going back to the church, and as I said, I think there are huge differences across countries. It's not there were protests where religion had very little to do, and so anti-gender protests where religion had very little to do with the whole thing. So it was in the background, of course, but not something that was very important. And somehow ideas about religion are rarely brought up. So, for example, when the government made an argument about why gender studies should be banned, the notion that it's just not sort of anti-Christian, or this is against the Bible, that just did not come up. It was not.
May I interject with just a question here? It seems to me, let me ask you, that there's, what you described has a quality of creating internal enemies. So there's the external enemy that's created in Hungary by the stigmatization of migrants. But much of what you described creates not just an image, but actually in addition to the Roma, populations of people who can be hated.
Yes, who are excluded from citizenship. Yeah.
So this is a very interesting thing that has not been brought out very much in much of the literature that I read. So this creates single women to be hated and a whole list of identity types that can be identified as yet again an enemy because you're not reproducing the nation and so on.
Yes,
Do you think that's
yes, absolutely. So they reshaped I think I tried to argue that they reshaped the ideal citizen, the characteristics of the ideal citizen, which and defined who the ideal citizen is as belonging to a very small group in a very specific way. They need to be mothers, and if you're a woman, you have to be a mother of several children, and simultaneously you have to be working for wages. But to go back to your question about the divorce, so why are people who are divorced not eligible? Interestingly, it's if in a couple, if one of them is divorced, that's okay. It's only if both of them are divorced that they're not eligible. I don't understand, but truthfully, Hungarian government politics are not always rational. So it is. So I don't think this is driven by a sense of religiosity, because then what does, women over 40 are also not eligible to get this benefit. What does that have to do with religion? But as it becomes, as there's more discussion on this, maybe this will be clear, or maybe this will come up again.
Kelly, and then.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I think my question builds on the last couple of questions. I guess from what my limited knowledge about anti-gender movements is that I think in certain ways it's like a proxy for something else, and I'm wondering if that seems to you to be the case in Hungary. And to the extent, so I noticed in your images that the term used is gender in English, and I'm wondering about the role of that and to what extent anti-genderism is more an index for anti-cosmopolitanism, anti-Western, anti-liberalism, and so forth. And yeah.
Yes, I agree with you completely that to some extent the notion of anti-genderism and all these arguments that I presented has to do with identification with the global right. Basically saying we belong to a right-wing sort of populist politics. And this is why it was important that this was one of the first pieces of legislation that the government brought, because it simply symbolized where they belong. The ban on gender studies. There are maybe 25 students who get MA degrees in gender studies in a year in Hungary. I mean, it's not a huge, also of the 25, there were maybe only 10 who were Hungarians. So they banned the degree because they produce 10 Hungarians a year with this degree. I mean, they don't seem to be a huge threat to the nation. I don't think. So it's symbolic in many ways. And indeed, arguments that anti-gender activists make suggests an identification with all these other values that you said, or at least some of those other values that you suggested. But they also have very specific targets. And so, for example, same-sex marriage. In some countries, like in Poland, reproductive rights, like that. In Hungary, you're right, it was mostly symbolic. So again, it was mostly a symbolic identification with a special kind of politics. Did that answer the question? Or did that suggest something?
And I think it does identify people to hate. Those cosmopolitans who are not
yes.
in that. Who were the... Yeah.
Thank you so much. Super interesting talk. I have two questions. One goes back to the earlier questions about masculinity or like families. So you say that this new regime is producing new sort of gendered images of an ideal citizen, and you talk a lot about women. I'm wondering if there is any new sort of talk about the new Hungarian man in this discourse, and if there is, what does he look like, and what are the qualities of the new man? And the other question is about anti-communism, or I guess communist legacy. I'm just curious if any of this anti-genderist, also anti-equality talk, or the promotion of sort of gender difference, whether there is any legacy and any talk, explicit talk about anti-communism. A lot of the pronatalism harkens back to the 1970s pronatalist policies, but also 1970s was very much about sort of a backlash against equality, right? So I was curious about this.
Interestingly, no. So never have I seen the concept of communism and how, you know, terrible communist egalitarian women, that never came up. It's always Western feminists, Western lobbies, the UN, George Soros, the whatever foundation, you name it. So they somehow forgot about that part. So even though there's less and less talk about the bad old communist times, but it still pops up now and then. I have not seen it pop up in the Hungarian anti-genderist discourse at all. And the question about men, it's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer. Most of the discourse talks about women or to women. There's a whole lot less talk about men. I don't think that an image of the new man has been presented, other than that it's a family man or a man with a family. But that's the extent of it. It's something that it's also, you're right. I somehow took it. I didn't think about that. That this has implications for men as well, which are invisible to the extent that I can tell so far. This, by the way, is this pronatalist plan is actually quite recent. So it's been happening for the past 2 or 3 years. So it's still taking shape. And the vision of the man. I was struck by the image of the grandfather in this poster. You would not expect that.
I was just curious, so when Orban says something like, I'm the guardian of Christian Europe, is that primarily to be interpreted as him positioning himself against non-Christian migrants?
Yes.
So is there an element of anti-Semitism in that as well? Or is that, so I'm trying to figure out where, like the attack on George Soros, like is that part of an anti-outsider who also happens to be Jewish kind of position? Is it also perceived as a threat by the Jewish minority within Hungary?
Yes, it is, because the posters and the way that the anti-Soros posters and the the migrant is presented sort of reeks of symbolisms that are related to anti-Semitism. So there was this one poster of Juncker and Soros, and they choose pictures that sort of bring up images of the typical Jew, and they talk about him as the speculator. So they use words that have been used to describe Jews. Yet the government, of course, denies its anti-Semitism and is best friends with some members of the Israeli government. So I think actually that they're using references to anti-Semitism strategically. Again, to create fear, to create anxiety in groups of people who respond to that. And they do that very successfully, actually.
So then just to clarify, so when the policy has a racist, so when some of these policies have sort of certainly racist intent, but also racist realization against the Roma, are Jews within Hungary sort of excluded from the policies in any way, or are they?
No.
Okay.
No. It is these policies. The pro-natalist policies exclude the Roma, and the sort of the overall racism is directed more against the migrants. And this notion, the references to Christianity has nothing to do with religion, at all. Really nothing at all. But it has to do with basically an anti-Muslim sentiments and anti-migrants.
There was there's
Thank you for this. I just wanted to ask you a bit more to kind of map the relationship between the state and what seems to be the kind of right-wing grassroots movement. So my understanding is 2010, Fidesz comes into power, but 2010s also the anti-gender movement comes about. And so I'm just curious as to how do these movements position themselves vis-a-vis the state? Like, is it a critique of the state somehow failing in the family, that they are trying to push the state further because it's corrupted by, this international gender agenda, or is it more kind of a cohesive relationship between the state? Do they invite politicians from Fidesz to come and speak at the rallies? I'm just trying to get a sense of how to map the relationship between the grassroots and the...
It's a lovely question. There is no such thing as grassroots, unfortunately. Grassroots, seriously, so the harassment of civil organizations is serious. Anything that's real grassroots has pretty much been eliminated, because you can't have, there are small organizations where volunteers work and try and do something, but you need funding for that. The state has eliminated all funding to real grassroots organizations. So instead, there are fake grassroots, fake civil organizations. So the one that published this little booklet, for example, is an organization, a civil organization funded by the government that pushes the agenda of the government. They're not different from the government in any way. The anti-gender movement also is, on the one hand, of course, communicated through spokespeople of the government, and also through little organizations that are funded by the government. For example, the Organization for the Families, for example, or the Organization of Young Families. It sounds like a grassroots sort of group that, but no, it's actually a government-funded little agency that whose funding would be immediately eliminated should they publish something other than what they're actually saying. So I don't think you can talk about, in Hungary at least, a true grassroots movement of any sort. The protests are sometimes organized around certain issues, but you can't quite call that sort of a movement. And in Hungary, actually, there has been no sort of real anti-gender protest so far.
Yes, you've had your hand up for a while.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was a lot of fun. It gave me a lot of anxiety.
It should have. I'm glad. That was the goal.
Great.
Seriously.
A comparative question for you. I read anything a right-wing individual writes online in this particular political space. And it's very clear in the American political landscape that there's a great philosophical paradox in between this great anxiety against gender and everything that represents theoretically that things might not be as they seem. This just creates the backlash that you're talking about. It creates in Hungary as well. So that's also here, of course. But also at the same time, there is the other side of it for the same individuals generally, that things cannot be what they seem. It has to be fake news. It has to be secret Muslims in between Central American refugees. Everything can be what they are not, seemingly. So this paradox is here very clearly, very ostensibly. I wonder how it is in Hungary.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you?
So I think at the roots of the gender anxiety, at least
yes.
here, there is this philosophical fear.
Yes.
That the right wing ideologically puts forward, that things must be what they seem. Don't let them tell you things can be what they are not. A trans person cannot be what they say they are. They have to be what they were born as. But at the same time, the same political group, the same individuals, have to invest their philosophical energies in arguing that things cannot be what they seem when it comes to, think of all the fake news business when it comes to the American rise of the right, the secret of pedophilia rings under pizza places, like all kinds of crazy stuff, right?
Yes.
I wonder how it is if this paradox also exists in your observations among the Hungarian right.
It seems to me that the Hungarian right are clearly buying the propaganda. So the notion that there is that there's fake news out there or the understanding of reality is closely guided by whatever is being published in the government-controlled media. So given the strength of the propaganda machine, it seems to me that I don't think people have anxieties about fake news. But I might need to think about that a bit more, and I might need to ask you to reformulate the question in a way that I understand, or if somebody can help, then I'm...
I think maybe one more question.
Thank you so much. This is not a reformulation of that question.
Okay.
But it occurs to me that, okay, so Orban and like Netanyahu and Bolsonaro and Trump are all these kinds of like figures of crime and criminal intent but they're also like at the top of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something charismatic about these guys. There's something that's like that people seem to like latch onto. And so I'm wondering, I'm wondering like for Orban, like what is it beyond the charisma that is like so that he is able to like create like a whole apparatus of like like not just policy but also like a whole philosophy behind that. And I think like, you know, in each context like there's a very specific history there, and so I'm just wondering like how it all coheres like in his figure.
It's an excellent question, and I think I can give you an idea about what's going on in Hungary. I think it's not that not so much that he's charismatic. It's because the government has a very clear pattern. They create the figure of the enemy. This is called the politics of fear. They create the figure of the enemy, and then they depict themselves as the only people on the face of the earth who can then rescue you from the grip of the enemy. And the enemy for Hungary, so basically the Fidesz won the previous election without uttering a word about its political program. Literally, there was no mention of economics or society or the welfare or any of this stuff. The only thing they said was, there are all these migrants. The European Union wants to force migrants on us. These migrants are going to rape you. These migrants are going to take your work away. They're going to change our culture. We will come and save you. We are the only people who can save you. So this kind of discourse is what produces the kind of and if you hear nothing but this kind of discourse, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you also are experiencing a degree of economic prosperity which is beyond Orban's control, but it just so happens that this is the post-crisis period. Right now, the unemployment rate in Hungary is about 3%. There are jobs everywhere, that are really horrible jobs, and without very little control over what the labor conditions, but they're jobs. In addition to the to the workfare programs, I think workfare is important because it did decrease poverty. So to some of these, I would argue, extremely exploitative yet, in some sense, programs that are nevertheless improve the standard of living for people. So those two elements, I think, are the basis of his popularity, not his charisma.
Okay, so we have some goodies for you back there, and please let's continue the conversation, and thank you very much.